Hi, everyone. My name is Destiny Ballard, and I'm really honored to be here tonight. I will be sharing with your community class part of a book that I'm actually working on called Life and Ritual. So what I'm going to be discussing is going to be derived from that work specifically. And it addresses a lot of different points on ritual itself, how my approach to ritual has evolved over the years, and where I hope it's going to go, or what I'm looking forward to it going within the community itself, as well as discussing a lot of other points. But I'll get into that in a minute. Yes, there will be PowerPoint. No, it will not be exhaustive. I will kind of be toggling back and forth between the two. The thing that I do ask is that where questions are concerned, I'm not really going to have an opportunity to monitor the chat. So I understand if while I'm speaking, something's sort of excite your thoughts or get you curious or thinking. I prefer you kind of save that until we get to the Q&A section, which will be at the very end. So that means we'll have our first segment, then an intermission, our second segment, then we will be having our Q&A. So discussion in the chat is not distracting to me at all. Please feel to communicate with the other attendees, but understand that I'm not going to be in a position where I can monitor that while I'm giving this presentation. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to take note of it. And also it will have to be brought back to my attention if something was put into the chat while I'm presenting, because I won't have the ability to go back necessarily and see what your thoughts were or what any questions were. Other than that, let's get started. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen here with you in just a moment, and we're gonna begin that super fun screen sharing PowerPoint action that everybody loves in every meeting ever that ever was Zoom. Okay. All right, so what I'm bringing to you today is basically something that evolved out of a work that I've been dabbling in since maybe early 2013, but it didn't solidify into an actual endeavor until late 2014, bleeding into 2015, and there was a lot of reasons for that. So for the first part, my name is Destiny Ballard. I've been involved within pagan and heathen spaces for a little over 3 decades. I began specifically walking in the heathen path around 2002 with the establishment of a kindred out of a study group, and then officially took on the role of Githia, or priestess and chieftain, in 2003. Prior to that, I had already been doing and functioning within ministerial services within my community. I come from first a secular humanist background into a Wicca background, into an eclectic paganism, which then led into heathenry, which is where I have occupied most of my spiritual space, since 2002. So it's been a long time. It has been a great and fantastic journey as well. So jumping into this, here's my disclaimer, so everybody knows what's going on and you understand what's happening. I will be utilizing some academic research and ideas during this presentation, but what I'm expressing is personal. So this is an opinion-based thing. It's not necessarily an expository examination of ritual in and of itself, but it's not completely a purely layman endeavor either. It's a learning opportunity that encapsulates my specific experiences and the teaching that I've done and what I've witnessed and what I've facilitated as a ministerial servant within this new religious movement. It also, as I mentioned previously, aligns with the work that is currently still in progress, but nearing its final stages, and then hopefully, some fine editors will get it cleaned up for me and we can get it out there for the world. But it also is very specifically through my personal lens as somebody who's a North American. That's where I was born, that's where I was raised, and that's where I currently reside. So please keep that in mind while I'm facilitating this discussion. that I'm specifically talking through that lens, both as a person who moved through those spaces within general paganism, then into heathenry, then specifically North American, as far as the culture that I was engulfed in and I was raised in. The other important things that you need to know about me is that I'm obviously and clearly a person of color. That background is a bit more complicated than I had anticipated, but it's one that still matters to me. So in those identities, there I am of Middle Eastern descent, but specifically Black, and I am of several European mixtures, and apparently Native American. I do not claim Native American because I was not raised within that culture. I have no connection with any tribal groups whatsoever. I am empathetic and sympathetic to those movements and those peoples, but I feel that it's inappropriate and also reckless to associate myself with that group because I have had no cultural integration with them whatsoever outside of my own personal interactions with persons who identify that way. So I want to make that very clear. I'm also, I identify as queer. I do consider myself a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, which was also part of what initially got me involved within ministerial services, in not only just in pagan spaces, but in alternative spaces as well, or subgenres. The point of that being, I wanted to be able to officiate commitment ceremonies for people. But most importantly, at the time that I did move into that ministerial service and was able to get myself educated and ordained, we were still in the lingering grips of what was the AIDS crisis. And there were not people to give final rites, and there were not people to facilitate funerals, and there were not people who could have access to hospice, especially if they didn't have a traditional family status. And my and others being able to step in that role with an official ministerial designation were able to do that. Since then, that work has evolved into now I'm able to also do, along with my kindred, research into areas, outreach rather, into areas including rehab for both physical, mental, and drug addiction, places of incarceration, obviously. I do have access to persons who are in the service. I am able to act as an advocate on behalf of people who have had catastrophic injury and probably don't have all of their paperwork in alignment, but need consultation or advisement from a person to whomever is in charge of that and does not want to use who's generally stationed within a hospital as their chaplain or as their patient advocate. So that's something else that we've stepped into a lot, especially with this pandemic, is having people who don't necessarily have a set designation, or the designation that they have is vague and simply states pagan on their paperwork. Also, just as a plug, please get your papers in order, please. So if you haven't filled out your medical forms and you don't have a living will, I just want to slide that right in there. But anyway, that's where my work has taken me. That's where it is. So let's move on to exactly what it is that we're going to be covering today. So for this first part, what we're going to be examining is kind of the basics. What is ritual? Who is it for? Then we'll be moving into the differences within ritual, high ritual, and what I frame or call lived ritual. This will also include my breaking down some of the differences, not only in how I define them and describe them to others, but sort of what ceremonies are encapsulated with those and how we come to understand them, and the ways that we encounter ritual in our everyday lives that we probably don't readily acknowledge. Then after that is my why bother section. And this is pretty much just going to be me talking to you about why should you bother with ritual? And the fact of the matter is it's completely up to you. I find that there's tremendous benefit in doing so. And I hope that maybe from what I share today, you'll get a sense of that as well and find a way to incorporate it for yourself that'll work. But I personally am a huge advocate of ritual in both spiritual and my secular life. And I'll get into a little bit of the reasons of why. That is for me personally, but also why I think anybody in any walk of life should give it a consideration at least. Then it's my favorite part, but I'm an atheist. I understand. I do, and I don't say that condescendingly. And the very first thing that I want to bring up is that if you are an atheist or you lean atheist or humanist, it is not my goal in any way to change your mind. That's not what I'm here for. I'm not here to change your mind. What I am hoping to do is to build stronger relationships and communication, and that interfaith can at last start to maybe incorporate atheist and humanist groups, even though that they might be somewhat hesitant to ascribe themselves or mesh with something under the umbrella of interfaith. I think it's extremely important. A lot of our goals can be in alignment. Human first is extremely important, especially when we're talking about the environment and equity and social justice. So I think it's more important than ever that we get these people sort of working with us and us working with them, and remove those prejudices and differences in terms of approach to any sort of religiosity or spirituality whatsoever. And also find ways that we can incorporate ritual to move forward in what we do share in common. And so I'll dip into that a little bit. Where does atheism fall in that? What are the benefits that I think are available to secularists and so on? And then finally, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about where I began with ritual and what changed my mind, how it changed rather drastically over time, and really a 180 and how I approach things, my feelings and thoughts about it, and sort of dig a little bit into that, possibly say some things that will be mildly controversial. I doubt it, but we'll see. And then I'm going to give you all some time to gestate on that. So we'll take our break. It'll be about approximately 15 minutes. I'll make you aware of that. And at that point, I'll stop recording temporarily. And then I will go and take my break, and then we will be returning at the 15-minute mark, and then I will get everything started again and give you a little bit of a warning about when we're going to start recording again. For part two, and I hope you stick around for that, I will be talking about academia and the experiential. I'm going to explain what that means a little bit more when we get to that section, but I just want to let it stand as it does now. Then I'm going to be dipping my toe in, and I mean that, just my toe, because this is a topic that deserves a class or a discussion in and all of itself. And that is discussion of within our new religious movement, specifically in the spheres of heathenry and druidry, we have a lot of Abrahamic and Wiccan baggage that we need to deal with. And we need to talk about it, we need to discuss it. And it specifically relates to ritual and our approach to ritual, and why we're hesitant in some ways and why we're rigid in others. And so that's kind of where that comes in. That's where it plays in with this discussion on ritual in general. Then we're going to talk about the big bad UPG. So the unsubstantiated personal gnosis, the naughty, naughty word, the naughty, naughty phrase that comes up in almost every online forum that you encounter anywhere. Somebody's always saying something about the UPG, how it's bad, how it's no good, how it ruins, authenticity, and even, collapses the integrity of our religious movements. I'm here to argue not quite that UPG is the be all end all and should be a part of anything, but why we need to maybe re-examine the use of those words and why they matter and how to apply them a little bit better. So we're doing less alienating, more self-reflecting, and really kind of understand what it is we're trying to communicate with others when they're sharing ideas with us that we haven't been able to substantiate ourselves and we cannot find within available text. Then we'll be moving into another one where, again, this will be toe number 2, because normally it would be a very large topic across a lot of different spectrums and disciplines. So this is specifically about identity. How do we see ourselves? Who do we see ourselves as? Who do we see ourselves as part of a whole? And how that pertains to ritual and how we interact in ritual and how we want to present ritual or incorporate it within our lives. This is especially important segment for me because I'm going to be discussing not only personal identity, but the identities of many others who often get left behind when the focus is ritual. So marginalized groups specifically that we don't think about as we're creating ritual and we're moving into those sacred spaces, and how to be both accommodating and still celebratory in what we do. And also how ritual can serve people in a way through acts of service that do not have to be religiously tied, but still be tied to our social responsibility to others within our community. And then finally, we're just going to have a very nice discussion about ritual spaces and works. Some of the things that I've done, some of the things that have worked really well, some of the things that we're all pretty familiar with, the adjustments that have had to be made, and suggestions for how you can utilize spaces within your home, utilize spaces within even your workspaces, find areas out in nature and in your urban communities for ritual and time, and even in your car. So that's it. And at the end of that, we'll be jumping straight into questions and answers, where I hope you won't beat me up too badly, and then we'll get going. Okay, so let's move on. So first and foremost, we're going to start with what exactly is ritual. As you can see here on the screen, what I have is the definitions, the definition entries as laid out by the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary that kind of lets us know what the working function of ritual is. So in its first definition, right, as an adjective, it's of or relating to rites or rituals, ceremonial. And then it has an example, ritual dance. And then two, according to religious law. So religious purity, or in alignment with religious purity or law. And then three, done in accordance with social custom and norms. This one's super important, and the one that I want people to really hone in on, because as of now, we're not in a nation that's specifically theocratic or aligned with a specific religion. And as such, a lot of what we do as North Americans is very much aligned to our regional customs and cultures. Very much aligned to that. So while the influence of Abrahamic religions and Christianity specifically permeate a whole lot, we are very, very, very regional, partially because of the size of our nation, and partially because there's sort of a homogenization that has taken place. That is, we don't have the same sense of shared nationality or ethnicity as a lot of other countries do. So we tend to be a little bit more fragmented in how we identify. And so social custom, and I'm sure many of you have probably heard this term before, personal thew or regional thew, regional law or understanding, usually takes precedent in what we're doing. This includes ritual. And that means ritual on the secular level, and also ritual on the religious level. Next, we move into the noun, ritual as a noun, and the established form of ceremony, the order of words prescribed for religious act. Ritual observance comes next, specifically a system of rites, followed by a ceremonial act or action, or an act or series of acts regularly repeated. So what's interesting here is when we look at all of this and we think about ritual as it's described, when we translate that over into how it actually applies to our lives and how it functions in our lives, it's usually, it's not this linear. So for most, you're going to have several types of ritual, and ritual will represent different things. Primarily, most of us are very, very familiar with the rituals of milestones or rites of passage. So those would be things like graduation, weddings, the passing of somebody, death and grieving, the birth of a child, different kinds of unions, adoptions, coming into new or forming new groups, fraternal rituals that, create systems, clubs, things like that are all the rituals that we're pretty familiar with. Then we have things that are more specific and more religiously geared, dedications, sacrifices, taking of sacrament itself, the sharing of blessed or communal wines or other drinks, the sharing of specific foods, standing in ceremony with one another, singing in unison, and even ritual dancing. And then finally, at the end of that, we have what is known as very high structured ritual. And those are rituals that come out of traditions that have very specific purpose for very specific reasons. It must be done in a certain way, usually at certain times, by a certain person for a specific purpose. And sometimes they can be communal and sometimes they can be individual, but they're highly, highly structured. So as we can see from the variety here, this is something that spans most of the human experience. And because of that, I feel that it's one of the evidences that, for me at least, that ritual has a place in the human experience, regardless of where you stand on religion. So even if you find yourself not being necessarily a religious person, I think that the value of religion can still be found within your life and can still be applicable in what you do, especially within social justice movements. So moving on, who's ritual for exactly? So when we talk about ritual and who it's for, the fact of the matter is that it's for us. It's for us. It's for the people. It's for the humans. And it's something in this context that's uniquely human. So what studies have found that has been interesting about rituals specifically, even without superstition application, but superstition can play a role as well, is that we like it a lot. Human beings like it a lot. And it's about our sense of both control and belonging. So what's interesting is the rate of ritual and the occurrence of ritual tends to rise when we're in crisis or facing crisis. Especially the larger scale of the crisis, the more ritual and ritual adherence tends to go up, and the more we seek it out. And it is a methodology for control of self and control of environment and finding a place of belonging within all of that. So for a lot of human beings, the need to bond with others, especially in the face of crisis or in challenge, is to find something that is bonding on a level that creates sameness, sometimes routine, a sense of belonging, and most importantly, a sense of control. This is especially something that falls into place or happens often when you have people jumping into religious acts or jumping into religious services immediately following crisis. One of the things that we've seen during the coronavirus pandemic is that a lot of people were very adamant about not giving up their ability to attend church in person, unmasked, to be in that group setting and to be able to worship as they wanted, even though by medical standards it wasn't safe. It was something that they clung to very deeply, even to the point where feeling that to not do so would deny them the protection that they thought would be greater than even isolating or covering their faces or perhaps getting the vaccine. It was more important to them to have to be part of that group setting and that function of ritual than to take any other precaution ahead of that. Now, where some people pointed out, some politicians and then a lot of academics said, maybe our approach was a little off in the beginning, and that instead of just condemning these people, we should have really gotten the leaders involved in those groups to have honest discussions with their parishioners. And instead of making it a thing that they should not worship, but making it part of why it was important for them to participate in those acts of keeping their neighbors and their fellow congregants safe. So ritualizing the process, as it were, of taking these precautions and incorporating it within the larger ritual of their practice. Maybe we would have had a little bit more success. We've seen it turn around a little bit where now more and more Christian groups at least have started actually doing things like opening up vaccinations within their church settings and encouraging mask wearing while still conducting their ceremonies, or moving ceremonies to outdoor spaces where they can conduct them as well. But the point of all of that is it's for us featherless bipeds who like to feel like we belong to things and need an identity. So we pretty much as human beings walk through the world wielding all kinds of audacity and then using a bodily shield of belonging and identity to shield us from all the things that we go crashing through. So ritual plays a role in that, because intrinsically as human beings, our desires to be a part of something. So even if it's not ritual in the highly spiritual sense, ritual still plays an important role in our lives. It's something that we want to belong to. One of my funniest examples was my belonging to a group in high school called the Nonconformist Conformist group. So the whole point of us being together is that we were non-conforming to the regular trends of everything else, but in doing so, we ultimately had to conform as a group, and as such created our own little special rituals all the way from breakfast to lunch to break to after school. So what I'm getting at is that it's a human need, and it's a deep one, and it's not one that we're going to get away from very easily, no matter where you stand on things. So I want to delve a little bit more into where I stand personally on ritual, who it's for, why I think it works, and basically why I'm here talking to you about it, right? So when I talk about ritual, I mean, it's a realization that sometimes, even in tandem with things that don't seemingly make sense, like superstitions, what the work has done, what the studies have shown, is that it does have an impact on us. Sometimes even up to and including not only actual performance, but brain activity, heart rate, how we feel about ourselves, how we approach things, lifting our level of confidence. People are probably familiar with things like wearing your favorite jersey to a sporting event, right? Or doing things like crossing a certain way or walking a certain way or wearing a certain item of clothing or wearing certain symbolisms, is all part of the ritual process. It's all part of that. And anthropologists, sociologists, theologians, and so many others have been working on this and the understanding of it. And I could rattle on about it forever and go down all those deep rabbit holes. My point is that it's significant enough that within and across all of these studies, it's been shown over and over again that it does have an impact on us psychologically, neurologically, and emotionally. So that's what we need to remember. But the other thing that I want to point out is, even though our brains are pretty weird and magnificent, when I'm talking about ritual and I'm talking about need for ritual, I am not in any way implying a relationship between what is understood as instinct in the natural world and what it is that humans do when they want to attach themselves. So it's like that was something that came up in a conversation, which I thought was strange. So now I feel compelled to add that every time. But someone had pretty much equated ritual with the instinct or the natural inclination of animals to do certain things or behaviors with ritual, with human behavior with it amongst ritual, with not equated at all. I don't want to in any way, shape, or form conflate any relationship there. I don't think humans have a natural instinct towards ritual. I think what we do have is an inclination towards belonging, and ritual plays a role in that. So I just want to be very clear there. I don't want to get into that. When you think about things from like my picture examples here are showing like a formal tea sitting, highly ritualistic. Your favorite sports jersey, like I've already mentioned, midsummer offerings, which is part of what you're seeing there on the other side of the screen. That's from my quarter out in my backyard. Ceremonial dances, wedding toasts. It permeates everything. And it's something that not only permeates everything, we get super excited about it. We get overjoyed when we think about having the opportunity to participate. Generally, when we're going to be celebratory with others and we're thinking about things like birthdays are rituals, and they're structured in different ways in different cultures, but they are ritualistic. They are marking the passage of time for somebody. They are marking a milestone. There's usually a gathering of others. There's a communal sharing of some kind, be it gifts, food, or otherwise. It's ritualistic. And then we have things like wedding toasts. Most people don't think about that as being a ritual aspect within the ceremony itself, and just think about the act of two persons being aligned in marriage as the ritualistic aspect of it. but there's so many rituals ingrained within weddings, even in North American ones. Everything from ring exchanges, from who's going to be part of bridal and groom parties, what guests hold what status, who's allowed to approach the altar at what time, what's going to be said, how you're going to demark the union. Then afterwards, to first dances, parental dances, the best man and maid of honor toast, to family toast, to general toasting, right? All highly ritualistic. For those who participate in rituals such as Stumble, well, pretty much the same thing. Very, 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 very ritualistic, obviously, but it's set and intentionally meant to be ritualistic. What's funny is that for people who usually experience it for the first time, they have one of two reactions. Wow, that was really deep and powerful, but also weirdly familiar. Or wow, that was really deep and powerful, but also super long and boring. So what we get out of it also matters on perspective as well. So for some, different aspects of ritual are not always going to resonate with them, which brings me into my next segment. So the differences exactly between ritual. Now that we've discussed who ritual is for, kind of how ritual functions for everybody, and what it's about, we're going to take a look at sort of what I've established within the pagan spheres anyway, is that like everything within the pagan spheres, there's myriad approaches to anything that you do, and that includes ritual. So I've kind of broken it down into this two-tier understanding that I utilize when I'm explaining it to other people, and that's basically high ritual and then what I call lived ritual. So what's the difference? All right, again, in my opinion. So when we're looking at high ritual, first and foremost, it adheres to fixed dates or milestones. So it's specifically related with something, right? A specific time and place and reason. It's in strict accordance with religious law, actual or perceived. So it means it's going in alignment with specific understandings and beliefs and follows to those rigidly. It's in accordance with cultural or historical evidence most of the time. So it's based on something that's known or understood, or at least as known or understood as it can be. And it has a fixed progressive ceremonial structure. So the way it progresses is very sequenced and is purposeful. It rarely deviates from that, and it stays on course with that. And then finally, it necessitates a hierarchy. So there's a need within high ritual for there to exist hierarchies. So moving on to live ritual. First and foremost, what we're looking at is that it is first in alignment with people and place. It borrows from culture and historical evidence, but it is not married to it or wholly rooted into it. It's subjective adherence based on group beliefs and customs, so not specifically religious law. This is about what people in your area and close to you think. There's structure with flexibility, so it's not fixed, although structure does exist within its approach. And hierarchies are mutable, meaning that they change often, and they sometimes even change during ritual. Now, the thing that I want to say, this little bottom note here, is very important to me because in my experience, what usually happens, before I go any further, I want to explain to you that what's been most interesting when I've been sharing this work with other people, and I especially get to this point, is when I present this here between the differences between high ritual and live ritual, how I explain them and I understand them and utilize them across not only what I do, but sharing that understanding with other people. Almost every single time, the immediate reaction is to silo these into groups of either good and bad, or Reconstructionists and Universalists. And I'm here to tell you, it's not that type of a comparison. It's not that type of a comparison at all. First and foremost, because those assignments don't really apply. In everything that I've experienced as far as rituals I've witnessed, rituals I've created, rituals I've read about, there has yet to be one that I have found that purely exists and underneath one of these tiers. More often than not, what's happening is we are having a jumping around between them. That's what's most common, So even in what I would define as high ritual, there are aspects of lived ritual in most cases, and in most aspects of lived ritual, there are accents or components of high ritual. Every single time, I've never seen it deviate from that ever, no matter how strongly aligned to one approach or another that's happened. So the other thing that I want to say is that you'll notice my choice of words and using high ritual versus lived ritual. High ritual specifically is about codification, about ceremony, about process, about following specific rules and for a specific end. And again, it necessitates a hierarchy. There needs to be somebody or someone who are in charge. And there need to be people who know what to do by following those people and following their instruction. And most of the time, the person who is doing that officiating is also the person who's acting as representative between the person and whatever sacral powers they're approaching. Within lived ritual, it is very much about the here and now. And when I say it's very much about the here and now, it doesn't mean that it doesn't contain aspects of older ritual, older understanding. It means that it's in alignment with people and place. So I, as a North American who lives in Northeast Oklahoma in a mostly rural community, align my ritual based on where I live, the people that I commune with in ritual, and my surrounding community. And of course, the natural land and existence around me in doing those things. It means borrowing, so not being mired down in culture or historical evidence. It means having an understanding and being comfortable with borrowing from, but moving it into a modern context or utilizing it through a modern lens. It's subjective adherence because ultimately the way lived ritual works is it has to function within the customs and the norms and the desires of the whole and those who are being served. So with high ritual, what's happening is that there's a way that things are structured. It is the people who must align themselves with the ritual. The ritual does not need to align themselves with the people necessarily. It has a set structure. So the purpose of the ritual, in part, is that the people who come into alignment with it towards a specific purpose, right? Whereas lived ritual is about being in adherence to what is happening within the group, its individual beliefs of the officiant or officiants or participants, or of the group as a whole. That is what's steering kind of the movement and the shape of the ritual in and of itself. So moving on to that next part, even if there is structure, most of the time it's not a fixed structure. It's, I don't want to say organic because it's not necessarily organic, it's usually planned, but there's structure without it having to be in a specific way at a specific time. It's not as regimented, it's definitely not as rigid, and it tends to evolve with what's going on. Many times, I know some of the experiences I've had with lived ritual, as it were, is natural occurrences. So things like rain or high gusts of wind, the appearance of animals, all end up being incorporated with that. Lived ritual also tends, while in still sometimes setting boundaries, they're not fixed boundaries. So in high ritual, usually whatever boundaries for sacred space are set up are not to be left without either guidance or assistance, or you simply wait till ritual is done. That includes if you don't show up in time to be included within the marking of those boundaries. Within lived ritual, there tends to be coming and going. It kind of never closes in that sense, especially if it's something that's happening over the course of events. The space itself is made sacral by the presence of others and by the working of ritual. So it's not ritual creating the sacral. The sacral exists because all of those things in that place, because all of those things are taking place there, if that makes sense. All right. So now that we've gone through all that, why bother? I bother. Okay, so this is an interesting question, and it's one that I had to ask myself, honestly, for a lot of years. I didn't know where I stood. I don't have any more slides for you right at this moment, but I will have some in a little bit. I didn't really know where I stood initially in the beginning. My parents were very, very, very much secular humanists. They both came from very religious backgrounds and had rejected it pretty soundly. It was not something that they wanted. What they did want, however, for me was to be able to explore my own spirituality and figure out where it is that I wanted to be and how I wanted to identify, and encouraged me to, one, always be very conscientious in my approach to anything and not to get caught up in the fervor of being a part of something, but also to stay open to participation and identity. The way I stumbled into paganism is its own interesting journey, but when I went through my initial term of paganism and was part specifically of a Wiccan tradition, it never resonated with me religiously. So I enjoyed the structure, I enjoyed the rituals, I enjoyed the community and the camaraderie. I enjoyed the protection it provided also as a person being of many, many, marginalized groups and also involved in a lot of subcultures. So it was a safe haven, as it were. But spiritually, not much, not much. I could make all the moves and I can go through all the motions, but I did not feel a connection to any sort of sacral power. There definitely wasn't any really deity in my life. I would often even say to some of my friends that I considered myself a closeted atheist, because while I believed in the power of collective belief and will, and that was for people to make change, but to make change with action, and to find inspiration in that through ritual, I did not believe that I was summoning any powers, that I was drawing down any powers, that I was bringing any powers together, certainly not invoking any deities into any person, absolutely not communing with spirits or elements or anything otherwise. What I felt I was doing was specifically trying to make a tuning fork of myself between myself and the natural world and my community. That's how I viewed ritual as a Wiccan, regardless of all the ceremonial aspects of it. That was how I approached it. So when I was doing it and I was going through those rites, what I was really thinking about was, how can I be the most present I can be in my body? How can I connect that to the people who are around me and be the most present for them? And that means not only just living and having my own experience, but experiencing with them what they're going through and what's happening. And then how do we take all of the energy and the ritual aspects of that and turn it outward into something that's going to be of use, not only within Coven, but within our community. When I left that very structured Wiccan path, I basically got to a point where I was going to have to go through a ritual process of initiation where I would be making a lifelong commitment, but not just a lifelong commitment, but a commitment to teach, a commitment to be a priestess within that. And I was wholly uncomfortable with it. It was not something that I felt I wanted to do, but I also didn't feel that paganism was something that I was ready to leave behind. So I moved into eclectic spaces, and then my head exploded because there was so much coming in so many different directions, and none of it seemed grounded at all. And ritual was very spontaneous. Lots of times it was also so not serious from my perspective, coming from a place where it had been very structured and very rigidly structured, especially within the tradition I was in. There were specific ways to do things. And while I was fine with letting go of that, the total abandonment of it was terrifying to me. I did not like it. It did not resonate with me at all. And then that's when it sort of clued into me, and I started doing my own personal research on what does ritual mean for human beings, because I finally got that understanding, like, oh, the sense of control and purpose that I had in ritual initially, even though that there wasn't a spiritual connection, is what's missing in this next step, in this new phase of pagan community that I've been involved in. And I think that is really what people are responding to when they have negative things to say about eclecticism, is that it's missing the elements that resonate with them that create structure and identity. It's not that it's bad or it's all necessarily loose and wrong or fluffy or however you want to term it. It means that it doesn't resonate with you as an individual as far as what it is you are seeking from ritual. And for others, it's more intense. And for others, it also aligns with other aspects of their lives, where they fall in their lives. Or for some people, a very non-structured situation, especially ritually, is going to be extremely important. Maybe they grew up in highly structured ones, and what they're looking for is freedom of expression, right? Ways to explore and dabble and even keep transitional and mutable their identities, spiritually and otherwise. And for others, they want more structure, but they don't necessarily want the rigidity that comes with most Abrahamic religions. And so you kind of fall in this middle place where you're wanting structure and you're wanting to create something that works, but you're not sure. So I was stuck then with figure out what comes next. And then I discovered heathenry. And to say that heathenry changed my life would be an understatement. To say that it has always changed my life for the better would be a lie. The fact of the matter is that while it's brought me into an intensely I'm just going to leave it at intense, as it's brought me into a very intense community. What it's also brought me into is having to confront a lot of things that I wasn't necessarily ready to confront when I first began the spiritual path. It's challenged me in my thinking, it's challenged me in what to do. But the best part of that is that, at least as a part of my understanding of heathenry, the reason that's so is because that's part of what being heathen is. It's exploring those things, it's doing the homework, it's understanding self and place, it's personal responsibility, it's community, and it's community with others. And so that to me felt right, as challenging as it were, that I should start to have these questions and I should start to ask myself, oh, well, you know, kind of what next? You know, what happens now? So for me, once I became heathen, and then not only that, the study group I had decided to become a kindred. And then they decided not to just be a kindred, then they decided that they wanted to be like a teaching and education kindred. And then they decided I was in charge. Fun, right? So after I panicked a lot, my very first thought was, oh man, I've been facilitating ritual and I've been doing these things on a broader scale for my community. And I've done some private things for our kindred, but now I have to really think about ritual, and I have to think about ritual the right way. Because I can't have them pushing me to the fore and saying, yeah, this is the head of our kindred. This is who's officiating our rites. This is who's sort of in charge of where we go with our spiritual learning and understanding and what we offer to others in the community, you know. So here she is. No, she doesn't know how to do ritual right. But who was saying that? Who was saying how to do ritual right? Well, the whole world that I had contact with. Because in the time that I've been pagan, I moved from a space where it went from literal postings at a bookstore, bulletin boards on a computer, Yahoo groups, Witchbox, social media. That's where we are. And progressively through all of those groups, there was always a way for somebody to tell you that you were doing it wrong in every forum. So I just want to point that out as well, especially if people ever start to feel overwhelmed in what they're doing or they're pursuing or their understanding of ritual and how it works for them or how it functions for them. You're going to get a lot of feedback. But I promise you now, if Facebook collapsed, Instagram collapsed, even if the old school Yahoo and them collapsed, there would be a bulletin board somewhere that would have an outline about how so-and-so did it wrong. Or there would be an article in the next pagan journal that outlined how that public ritual that was done by so-and-so group failed. And here's why. And not only here's why, but this is why it dishonored them, dishonored their ancestors, it dishonored everybody in attendance, or worse, my favorite back in the day was how everybody was either cursed or bound by an attendance at a specific ritual. That was always like the big boogeyman back then. Did you go to so-and-so's ritual? I heard there was a binding. Now you're bound to them, which I always thought was pretty amusing. I'm like, I came of my accord and I left of my accord. I'm fine, but there are people who take those things really seriously. So again, I was sort of struggling with my own internalized sense of possible atheism. I was struggling with lack of structure, and I was struggling in being a representative for my kindred and this new belief system that I had encountered and that had really resonated with me, which was heathenry. So how do I do heathenry right? I had no idea. In come the Reconstructionists. So they were ready. They were ready for me. And they were all too happy to have me latch on and show me all the things that I need to study and all the things that I need to learn about and all the ways that I can incorporate very structured ritual into what I was doing. At the same time, I have fed a lot of BS that none of us at the time really knew was BS, because even for hardcore Reconstructionists, they're operating off of some misunderstandings and misnomers and almost a complete and utter rejection of where they started, which was like this weird identity development that happened. But I'll get a little bit more into that later. So anyway, here I was stuck in, what do I do? What do I do? Because the more I got into Reconstruction, the more I was faced with some really hard questions. And the biggest part of what I learned about, okay, where do I go from here, was that I had this deep desire for more profound votive acts, for ritual that meant something more than my just showing up and holding a horn and lifting it up and drinking and possibly getting a little tipsy. I wanted more than that. And I love the communal aspect of it, but I was looking for something a little bit deeper. I was looking for something that, again, was going to help me sort of attune myself, not only to myself, but to my natural surroundings and to other participants. Then I heard the word Wicca true. What a weird word, right? So, which again, when I had first gone into things like directional calling with the hammer casting was pretty common. So was drawing rune boundaries and sigils. That was very, very, very common. Not only were there horns of mead or of wine, but guess what we had too? We had our little cakeys, right? So we're giving out cakes to everybody. And again, there was just sort of this disconnect of the development of where these now supposedly highly structured movements were operating from, that had these very, very, very different roots. And everybody was kind of ignoring that, while at the same time sort of sitting in a pedestal in an attempt to, again, reinforce identity. So you have to create some separation there by saying, we are not Wiccan. We are not Wiccan. We are not Wiccan. We are not Wiccan. And the way they said that was by doing a lot of Wiccan things. I'm jumping ahead though, and so I'm going to save that bit for a little bit later. So I felt increasingly less fulfilled, and I was in conflict about what it was that I needed to do. But more importantly, I looked around and I saw that a lot of other people who facilitated rituals and even attended rituals felt the same way. They felt hobbled. They felt like they couldn't move forward. There weren't ways to move forward. There was sambal and there was bloat, and a few fringe people were doing namings and such, and that's it. That's it. And anything else that was done was usually done in a private setting within your home. Among the Druids that I interacted with, it varied because most would adopt a hearth culture and then base ritual approach around that. So that varied. But those who had aligned themselves with heathenry tended to kind of fall within the same trap. What point are we expanding out into what we consider universalism or eclecticism, and at what point are we actually adhering to ritual and doing something that truly represents what heathenry is, or what our understanding of heathenry is? And it was scary because everybody seemed just sort of locked in a position while simultaneously really expressing that they wanted more. But then anytime anybody sort of stepped outside of those bounds and expanded on ritual, there was almost always backlash, almost always. And so that obviously doesn't encourage those things to continue. And so when sitting down and thinking about it, the very first thing that came to my mind was the first thing I have to think about doing it right is let go of what I think is right. So I had to let go of what my definition of right was. And I had to be prepared to de-romanticize my approach to both spirituality and ritual, and really look at what the purpose was. That changed my whole worldview. That changed how I approached almost everything. So I was no longer thinking about how to do it right based on any particular scholarly text, any established officiant, any particular religion. I thought of ritual only in terms of space and time. And what I mean by that is the space that I occupy with the people that I occupy it with at the time that I do. And what's its purpose? And building purpose that way, building purpose back from that instead of doing it the other way, creating a structured purpose and a plan coming in, bringing people together and saying, this is what ritual is now. So conform to the structure. And instead working backwards from that, this is the place where I am, these are the people I am with, this is the time I'm in, this is what's necessary for us to move forward. So eventually that understanding and my thinking on that helped to override my trepidations on whether or not I was going to be doing something right or wrong. But it didn't mean that I abandoned everything that I learned. And it absolutely does not mean that I stepped away from academia or scholarly research at all. I appreciate it, and it has an indelible place in the development, especially of new religious movements. But when I started thinking more about what I was wanting, not only as an individual, but for my kindred and for my community, it all changed rapidly. And letting go of my romantic ideas of heathenry was one of the hardest things I ever had to do. And that included a belief and a desire that I could actually be Reconstructionist. And I'm going to get into that in the second part of our talk. We're getting close to where we will be taking our break here. It'll be about 15 minutes long. So I'm just going to end on that note. Yes, I'm going to talk about Reconstructionism. No, you're probably not going to like it. Yes, I'm going to start delving into the other bits of why I've rejected certain parts and aspects of ritual and others. But that's it for now. Let's go ahead and take our break. Thank you so much for having me. I really hope you will join me for the second half. Again, that's where we'll be getting into academia and the experiential. We'll be talking about our Abrahamic and Wiccan baggage within ritual, ritual and identity, and basically the purposes and functions of ritual. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording for now. And it is just 7:59, well, my time, so 6:59. So let's go ahead and look at like a true quarter after the hour when to return. Thank you. Well, welcome back, everyone, to the second part of Life in Ritual. I will again be sharing a few slides with you this time. So just to cut down on my own level of distraction and having the ability to better navigate my notes, I'm going to just leave my fixed picture, my still picture up for now. But when I'm actually engaging you without any of that other stuff, I will go ahead and turn my camera back on so that we can communicate in as natural a way as you can on these platforms. So welcome back. I left off with my thoughts or my take on unsubstantiated personal gnosis, having to let go of my feelings of romanticism within heathenry specifically, and a little bit of a taste of what was going to be coming up ahead. So a lot of things that I addressed in the first half will kind of be clarified and better fleshed out in the second half. I really do want our Q&A session to be as dynamic as possible. So I'm dipping into a lot, but I'm not going super deep because, as mentioned before, a lot of these topics are ones that really deserve to have their own time and space. Maybe sometime in the future I can do that with you. Definitely as I get things established with this book. So I don't believe that there's anybody new with us. I think we're still with the same folks that had started out. So I will go ahead and share my screen. And then what we can do is just skim right over that academic disclaimer that seems to be all too important, especially in online spaces, okay? So again, this is just my little disclaimer and statement of purpose saying that this is about my opinion. It does involve some academic research. At the end of the presentation, once everything is all wrapped up and has been recorded and posted to the YouTube channel, I will be providing a citation sheet that can be requested. So you will have all the citations for everything that I was referencing, either in written slides or in as discussion points. So you know exactly where I was getting my information from besides just my live ritual. So that said, let's move on. So surprise, we're talking about academia and the experiential. So what you're not going to find here, as stated on the slide, is the typical language or comparative chart. When I talk about academia versus the experiential, I'm talking about things that complement and overlap one another in modern practice, as they should. Two key points are both are valid and necessary, and bonus, neither requires religious belief. Okay, so what I really want you to take note of here is the language that I'm using, the wording that I'm using, where I'm saying academia and experiential and not reconstruction versus universalism. And here's why. When again sorting through what it meant to me to live heathen and how to incorporate ritual within that, I was confronted with the reality that a lot of what I based my spiritual decisions on were tied up in some pretty fanciful ideals. So first, how exactly could I successfully reconstruct something that is pulled from such a wide swath of ancient fragments, especially when these fragments are only available through the lens of post-conversion adherents and scholars? The answer was jarring but simple. I couldn't. I truly couldn't. I was not going to be able to achieve true reconstructionism. What came next was my being forced to reconcile with myself that although there was a good amount of ancient heathen culture I fully embraced, there was also quite a bit I had no desire to emulate or perpetuate, even if only loosely understood in a modern context. It was not something that I wanted to be a part of at all. And so it very much had to change my approach to things. And it was a hard moment to have, and one that made me step back even for a little while, not for a long while, because it's extremely hard for me not to participate in my live and active community. And coming from a household that is entirely heathen, it makes it difficult for me to step back on those duties as well. It's a shared living experience that's intrinsically a part of every aspect of our lives. So sitting with that, it finally came that even if I held to some semblance of a reconstructionist approach, what was I really doing? Which specific heathen culture at which specific time was I going to choose to be my focus? Because if my approach was going to be Reconstructionist, I felt it deserved that much at least. It needed me to really make a decision on where and when I was pulling my information and my guidance from. And when I was contemplating that last question, what I was then forced to realize is that I had no aspiration at all to wholly commit myself to a specific moment in ancient heathen culture. What I truly aspired to was a nourishing kind of middle ground, rooted in the collective remnant of those things and the understanding of ancient heathenry. With that understanding, suddenly the idealistic notion of completely shedding our modern overculture kind of dissipated. And it dropped like a bag of bricks from off of my shoulders. I truly felt liberated, and I felt that I was free to actually live heathen the way I desired to. So that left me with what comes next. Now that, for me, personally at least, a full-on attempt at a truly reconstructionist approach felt almost kind of absurd. So the only viable way forward was to rebuild my approach to ritual and make it a central part of my spiritual life and secular life. So ritual is now not based on what was, but what is. What's happening in the here and now, which is something that I had mentioned before. So, using the historical evidence that existed, I continued my research there and I continued to expand my access. And I even made it a point, once we moved over to becoming a nonprofit group and not simply a kindred, to make the purpose of our nonprofit group an educational one, specifically education and outreach. So I started with what I knew, what I could get my hands on, and creating loose sort of outlines of surviving custom and understanding of pre-Christian ritual within the heathen spaces, as it were. What I didn't do was focus on specific areas or specific times. I focused on the evolving worldview and how that worldview would have inevitably continued to evolve. And so I took it for where it was at the time as best I could. And I combined that information with where I'm at and how I'm living and how I found value in what was presented in those things from the past so that I could apply them to where I am now. And hopefully others could even build on those and adjust them so they can continue to be applicable into the future. So I filtered through the lens of personal experience, again, where I was, and most importantly, my drive to serve other people. So I wanted to maintain those relationships. I wanted to give something of value and importance to my community. I wanted to foster relationships between us, and I wanted to foster our relationship with the natural world. So as those things came together, the next aha moment was an understanding there was no versus and only and. It had never been Reconstruction versus universalism, and it had never been academia versus experiential. It was and academia and experiential, Reconstructionist and universalism together. It was how we were going to move forward. It was how we were going to make the best of what we had. And it was the way that I could reconcile both my need for structure, my desire to be of actual merit and service to those around me, and to stay present in where I was and not get lost in a fantasy of the past. That brings us to one of the things that always gets in our way, and that's our baggage. So one thing that we contend with as modern adherents of new religious movements, or even as persons who are not religious whatsoever, is the baggage that comes along with Abrahamic religion, specifically Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And then, of course, the remnants of Wicca that are sort of foundational to all of this. When I bring this up most of the time in group settings, there's a lot of nodding and agreement that, yeah, there are things to discuss, there are things to look at, especially in terms of Abrahamic religions. Very few are willing to sort of acknowledge, or at least openly or readily acknowledge, where our baggage concerning Wicca is concerned. Now, there have been a lot of, that's not true. Lot is, a lot is incorrect. There have been a few significant studies into American heathenry specifically and our relationship with Wicca. And part of what's been discovered is, as I discussed earlier, it's not just a matter of setting boundaries for identity. It's also about, um, frankly, our distrust and our disdain for femininity and how Wicca aligns with that, especially being so feminine or goddess centered, as it were. Where Abrahamic religions are concerned, part of that is that because of who we are and where we live, these are things that are pretty much ingrained into every aspect of our structure, of how our nation operates, of how we do things. And that really is going to always have a deep, deep effect on how we move forward. So I'm sure all of us who have approached or been around people who essentially just take the settings or the deities of other religious pathways and replace them or rebrand them, as they were, with pagan thought or ideas. We do this also not just with the remnants of those Abrahamic religions, but we do them with Wicca as well. So we'll have things like aspects of the wheel of the year, aspects of the triple goddess, things like elemental calling, and different parts of eclectic ritual process that are part of even groups that would identify themselves as Reconstructionists or at least as historically close to possible. So here's where that brought me once I was dealing with that, dealing with the baggage of that, what I had to do when I stopped romanticizing the realities. So here we went, and this is what I came to. These are the conclusions that I met with. Abrahamic religions are so deeply ingrained in American culture and our structure. Every part. It's hard to separate ourselves from them, even when we're thinking consciously not to do so. And so sometimes our reaction is to retreat into fantasy, to move back into something that seems both foreign and beautiful or out of reach, or something that feels lost. And that's when we get into the fact that North Americans do not have a singular sense of national identity. We're far too large as a nation, number one, which creates more regional understandings of overarching cultural thought and idea and identity. And then we go down and work our way down smaller to that through different subcategories, such as religion, specific towns and places, even communities that we belong to. The sad part about that is for America to work, homogenization is required to keep current power structures working. I'm specifically speaking to white supremacy and also speaking to the structures that are in place that oppress Indigenous peoples, enslaved Black people, and make things difficult for marginalized groups such as women, disabled, and members of the LGBTQIA plus community. It is an essential aspect of those structures staying in place that we all have a sense of shared identity. And when I say all, I mean those who are deemed to be in power or should be in power, which specifically represents white, cis, gendered males. We must maintain that homogenization and fantasy of identity to keep those structures working. If we start to identify differently, if we start to move beyond those needs, then that can cause a lot of trouble and disruption that's not going to be wanted. It's also going to have to make us confront some things about our nation and who we are, how we function within it as religious persons or not, and what our responsibilities are because of that. Because of that lack of national identity, this leads to us being super romantic about things. So you find among North Americans this desire to always trace their roots, right? So when they say trace their roots, what they're really talking about more than culture is genetics. So you'll see often people speaking to the fact that they have Viking heritage, or they're of Celtic descent, or they are descendant from a specific lineage of monarch, or that they've had so many generations of so-and-so who are from Ireland, or so many generations from so-and-so who are from Norway, and on it goes. Interesting, right? Especially in spaces that deem to call themselves inclusive. Because what we're doing is we're trying to create an identity out of genetics. And in that identity of genetics, we're also trying to reinforce what we say that we're against, which is that sort of exclusion based on genetics, based on perceived race or ethnicity. Why is it so important to us still as adherents in these new religious movements that we find these connections? Well, it's important to us because we've been disconnected from what makes us feel attached, mostly not only to our immediate families, but to a community, but also religiously. So here we are, we're approaching something from an ancient time, from different continents, and we're looking at ourselves and we're trying to find our place of belonging. And that expresses itself in things like trying to fall deeply into Reconstructionism, even to the point of eschewing the modern world. Back to the land is something that's become a pretty big popular movement amongst heathens and druids. It's a desire. People talk about communal living. People talk about doing things differently. People talk about egalitarian setups and so forth. But the reality of those things are very, very different in having them applied, in living them, and making them of importance. Our desire to go to Iceland, our desire to go to Norway, our desire to go to Greenland, our desire to visit these places is again about time and space. We're feeling that missing component within something and desperate for a piece of identity that has been homogenized out of us through a sense of very loose and non-concrete nationalism that requires us to kind of move with one ideal in mind so that we can maintain the structures, the power structures that are in place. This is why I feel that coming to a specific identity within oneself will allow you to create something far more powerful than relating to something that is ancient and distant and not related, which moves me to the next point and de-romanticizing these realities. Now, when I say my ancestors, I'm not talking about my mother. I'm not talking about my grandmother. And I'm not talking about my great grandparents or anybody specifically in my direct genetic lineage. I mean all preceding human beings. When I talk about ancestors, I talk about my rootment and attachment not only to the earth, but to all those who preceded me on the earth. All the traditions and ways in being and presence that culminated in my existence. So now when I hail the ancestors, it's not my ancestors, it's the ancestors, meaning all. One thing that we have to really come to terms with and we need to face is that all current forms of Druidry and heathenry in North America have Wiccan roots, every last one. When it was, when they were both being revived in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, and were starting to come up as individual movements alongside Wicca and then eventually branching off and expanding beyond Wicca, everybody got their information pretty much from the same place. And it was all from romantic periods of, again, idealist Reconstructionism and Romanticism and Neo-European mythos. And then the hot mess, which is Wicca, that was for a long time touted as a secret and sustained pathway that was just newly re-revealed to people, you know. So very much all the talk about being the ones who survived the burning times, secret lineages, secret grandparents who were witches or pagans or otherwise. And when I say that, please understand that I'm not trying to be glib or take away from people who maintain folk cultures. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying what we understood Wicca to be, what we understand the practices of modern Druidry and heathenry right now as it's evolved over the last few decades had nothing to do with how it was presented to us or how it was structured to us. There were no secret high rituals going on. I mean, there were, but not in the way that they were being told to us or advertised. Grandma was not secretly a part of the Golden Dawn. She was not passing on this information. And no, no one you met was actually a secret, you know, high priestess of the Order of Avalon. That never happened. And as we come to terms with the fact that that never happened, we have to come to terms with the fact of the origins of Wicca and what it is, which is an eclectic new religious movement rife with appropriation, and again, created under a situation that put to the fore idealism and romanticism. And while we might have built on that, we need to be honest about our roots within it. We need to be honest about some of the ritual structures and forms that we use from it. And we need to be less derogatory towards those who still use or incorporate some pieces of it. It doesn't make any sense. And the fact of the matter is, it doesn't make any sense because, as mentioned earlier, it's all rebranded, all of it. And finally, this is where it gets a little controversial for some, but I'm going to say it because it's absolutely what I believe. All religion, all, began with UPG, or unsubstantiated personal gnosis, based on environment, which means regardless of whether or not you believe in sacral powers, whether you believe in divine intervention, whether you believe in divine inspiration, whether you don't believe in any of those things, at all points in time, all establishment of religion and ritual came from a point where a person or a group of people made a decision based on who they were, where they were, and what they believed, to believe in something more and structure it into religion and structure it into ritual. So it's very strange to say that experiential approaches or that UPG don't have a place. They absolutely have a place. They're foundational to why we exist at all. And that's my very strong opinion on that. So let me stop sharing my screen real quick because I have stuff to share with you. And I'll get my camera turned back on as soon as I can figure this out. Stop my share. Okay, so I'm back. Thanks for riding that ride with me. So now that we've gone through that and kind of where that is, that really brings me back into that big bad UPG section. Okay, so the scary that is known as unsubstantiated personal gnosis. Are there lines? Of course there are lines. There are absolutely lines, but we need to use reasoning, and we need to be careful and really think about context, when somebody approaches us with something that is a bit of personal gnosis, that is unsubstantiated. The fact of the matter is, regardless of academic rigor, anything regarding the sacral or religious is unsubstantiated. We don't have proof. We don't have proof beyond personal experience, which means it cannot be substantiated. It simply cannot. So all of it, everything that we're doing is part of and falls under the umbrella of UPG, which means that we need to be very, very careful. And when we're filtering, and probably look at adjusting our language, when we're talking about people who are sharing ideas or thoughts with us that may be detrimental to our practices and what we're doing, or detrimental to the community, versus saying that they're wrong simply because of personal gnosis. Those two do not equate. They do not equal the same thing, and intention does not always equal impact. Also, we have to think back to the time that when all of us began, and there was a beginning for all of us, the things that we believed or we thought or that we held sacred and true, which may not have always necessarily been true. So it's a know better when you do better, to quote Maya Angelou. Know better to do, when you know better, do better. And that's the best we can ask of anybody. Does that mean that we should just sit in spaces where people babble at us ridiculously and introduce strange ideas, or are married to the desire to please a specific cult of personality or anything of that nature? Absolutely not. we should call it out. We should call it out and we should put a stop to it immediately. We should challenge it. And we should first challenge it through constructive criticism and discussion and discourse. When that fails, then it comes the time to step in and have protection for community and take a stand. But that does not necessarily need to be under the label of unsubstantiated personal gnosis. It needs to be under the label of a person acting inappropriately, speaking inappropriately, and also being reckless with where they stand and unable to back up what they say, even with sound reasoning. That's where we need to move forward. I think sometimes we get a little bit too caught up in that. So UPG is something that I think that we should maybe get our panties out of a bunch about, is basically what I'm getting at. And moving forward, what we should really be focusing on is not just personal gnosis, but personal gnosis in concern to how does our identity relate to how we approach ritual and what we do. So knowing ourselves is the most important thing. And when I talk about knowing ourselves, I don't simply mean knowing who you are genetically. I don't mean being able to tell people what hometown you're from. Those things are important, but they are not the most important. I'm talking about making a real and genuine assessment of what your core values are. What motivates you? Not only what motivates you, what role does ritual play in your life? Specifically, do you find ritual necessary? And if not, why? And if not, also, what aspects are already a part of your life that you've been incorporating but not recognizing as ritual? Do they still maintain a place? And then, if the answer is yes, ask yourself why. And if you can bring conclusions that are positive and add to your experience, then think about incorporating ritual beyond that, beyond those rites of passages or milestones or celebratory moments or even work achievements. Ritual can have a place in your everyday secular life. It can have meaning. It can help bring stability and a sense of well-being and confidence. It can also create a sense of well-being and confidence and bondings with those around you. It does not have to be religiously based. When it is religiously based or spiritually motivated, then it can have profound impact on the human experience. And that has been shown not only in neurological studies, but in psychological ones as well. Also, anthropological studies show that when people come together in group settings for a specific or unified purpose, the level of bonding that happens is incredibly high. And from that, great action tends to take place. So it's not a stagnant thing that happens. It's something that grows outside of itself. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the idea of raising energy within a specific sacred space. Well, it turns out that on a mental and emotional level, we are raising energy when we participate in ritual acts and group acts. And I mean all group acts. So marching in band together, playing sports together, participating in actual religious ritual together, taking part in rituals such as baby namings and birthdays. It creates a sense of action and forward momentum, confidence and joy and happiness that allows us to move forward and do things with that. It's so important to know yourself and where you stand, because ritual cannot be meaningful if you don't know who you are and what's important to you. What are you going to base ritual around if it's going to be meaningful, if it's going to not just be something that you're simply parenting or moving through the motions of? So earlier when I was talking about the difference between high ritual and lived ritual, high ritual, again, is specifically structured and rigid. It is a set way of doing things for a specific purpose at a specific time for a specific reason. And the reason it is high ritual is because that structure requires that there be somebody or some persons in charge, but it also requires that participants adjust to the ritual. So you're opening a space, and it is those specific protocols that must be followed for that specific purpose in their specific order to its conclusion. Those attending must adhere. So that makes high ritual highly structured ritual. When I talk about living ritual, I mean ritual that is not structured in that way and instead functions from ritual adheres to the presence of others. So it's the time and place and being of other people participating in ritual that makes it ritualistic. what they do and add to it, the time and place and how it adds to it is what creates ritual within itself. It is living. So it is organic and living. It adjusts as we adjust in the time and space that we're utilizing it and we're participating in. So ritual adjusts to participant in lived ritual, and participant adjusts to ritual in high ritual. And those are the primary differences between the two. But as I mentioned earlier, they kind of dance back and forth between each other. I've yet to experience a ritual where there was not overlap of some kind. So knowing yourself where that is concerned is especially important. If you don't have a sense of self, you can't know what exactly you believe or establish what towards where your beliefs are evolving. You can't establish what you want to participate in. You can neither adapt to ritual or have ritual adapt to you because you're not certain in who you are. Now, the important part of that is when I say know yourself, I mean know yourself as you are. You obviously are going to change. You're obviously and hopefully going to grow. You're going to evolve. Your perspectives are going to change. It's important that you take time to constantly examine that, especially that since for those of us in North America, we live with the vast overarching culture, as loose as it is, tells us that individualism is only for success and is only for gain. It's not for knowing yourself, and it's absolutely not for communal good. Ritual asks that of you, that you know yourself in your place and that you exert it for communal good, which is why I feel so strongly about ritual becoming a part of lives for secular people as well, for those who are not engaged in any religious belief. If you're doubting the power of that, just look at any of the myriad of protests that happened last summer with BLM. Think about the collective power of those groups and how they came together and the will that they were able to assert and the changes that they were able to assert by their presence and their movement and their coming together, doing what? Marching together, chanting together, talking together, collaborating, focusing their will and their purpose towards a singular desire and putting those together. That's ritualistic. And there's room for that in all things and how we approach them. So once you have a firm grip on who you are now, and when I say firm, as firm as anybody can have, but it's good to take some time for some self-reflection daily if possible, at least monthly. Think about where you are, your relationships, where you stand in things. Who do you see yourself as? And a great exercise for that is do not describe yourself as your job, your relationship with another person. So you don't say, for instance, I would say I'm Destiny and I'm a writer and a reverend. I wouldn't say I'm Destiny and I'm a mother and a partner. I would say instead, I'm Destiny and I have a strong commitment and tie to the earth. I'm Destiny and I believe in communal good and communal sharing. I'm Destiny and I think ritual needs to play a central part in life for it to be most fulfilling, because we need ritual and structure for identity and for belonging, and more importantly, to move forward with social change. So finally, ritual spaces and works. The fact of the matter is it's important to make space for ritual. It's important to make space for focus. And that could be in the form of an altar, and it could be out in a natural place. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen with you again real quick because we're getting ready to wrap up, and these are the last 2 bits. So here's some examples of some of our ritual spaces and how we utilize them. So over on the top left here is Osage Hill State Park, where we host our annual event. This cliff here, which we lovingly call danger cliffs because of the warning sign put up by the rangers, is where we make water-safe, biodegradable sacrifice. So we go ahead and we make sacrifice there off of that cliff. To the right of that is a picture of my indoor altar. And that's where I gather things together. This sits in my living room and right beside my dining room, which makes it nice, especially when we're doing any ritual that's involving something like speaking with family members or sharing meals with the departed, or sharing some of our food with sacral powers. Down at the bottom is a park space that we use. So we basically just use a covered pavilion, and we've done everything from naming ceremonies to wedding ceremonies to just general gatherings, and even tumble in spaces like that. This last picture is actually from Midsummer, and this was done on some private land of some friends of ours. And we really decided to go all out and burn ourselves a wheel and get it rolling down the hill and into the water, which was a lot of great fun. Those friends are Druids, and we still usually manage to find ways to incorporate celebratory times together. So it's always lovely when they invite us out. These are all great, and these are all ideal. They're all also not necessary. Not necessary. So creating ritual for yourself, creating ritual spaces and works requires only you. And that's where the solitary aspect comes in. While I happen to be a very communally focused person, the fact of the matter is that ritual begins within. What you deem sacred is sacred because you say so. Period. That's it. You make it sacred because you say so, because you're putting the time and the effort and the commitment into making it so, into acknowledging it, and into incorporating it into your life. You're making space and time for it. You're breathing life into it. Solitary ritual, solitary practice is valid, extremely valid. It's sometimes highly potent, and also gives you the time to deeply reflect again on who you are and what you believe. Solitary ritual is also a way to kind of gauge where you are in terms of what you actually believe. What do you believe? What parts of the religion that you are incorporated with, or even just associated with, or by proxy to through a family member, what aspects of that do you believe? What parts of ritual that you've seen performed ring true with you, resonate with you? Do you have a connection with what you believe to be sacral powers? What is their relationship to you as far as you understand it? What's your relationship with the natural world? When you think about the earth, is it just, yeah, we shouldn't pollute it? Or do you have a living, reciprocal relationship with the earth, and specifically the local land and waters around you? What's your relationship there? How do you know them? How do they know you? Being in your room with your computer and focusing on your desire to improve yourself or others, or simply to just ground, is ritualistic, and it's valid, and it has meaning. Tools are wonderful and they're great, and humans love tools, but again, not necessary. You yourself, your body, your existence, your breath is enough for ritual of every type. Every type. And that means high ritual too. Anything that would be required to use as a tool, you can 9 times out of 10 use your body for. Here's where it gets a little tricky. As the pandemic has pretty much brought to light, it's been really difficult for us to gather in ways that we used to. And for us to come together in groups, in smaller groups even, or even to communicate regularly with each other face to face. What I want you to think about is the reality of that for those who cannot normally gather with us, or have recently lost the ability to gather us in general outside of the pandemic. When you're thinking about ritual spaces and works, you need to think also of equity, and you need to think also of inclusiveness. And when I say equity, I mean really making and creating circumstances ritually that are open to people and their needs. While it's not always possible to accommodate everyone, if we're mindful of those in our community, we give them the care and respect to ask them what their needs are. And then we rise to the occasion of meeting them. And not only that, not just by putting the burden on a facilitator, but making it a community endeavor. Anyone who participates in the ritual needs to participate in making it accessible, needs to participate in making it an equitable space, needs to remember people who can't normally get to ritual for whatever reason, and needs to make the extended, exerted effort to reach them instead and keep them a functioning part of our communities. It's been very sad the distance that we've had, and it's been very hurtful that there are a lot of in-person gatherings that had to end. But look at how quickly we adapted. Now think about all the ways those could have served marginalized peoples within your communities, either through ritual, instruction, or religious growth. That could have been happening all along. So we really need to think about how we're going to continue to incorporate that so we stop leaving people behind in what we're doing, especially concerning ritual. So that's about my time, and I want to wrap this up, and I want to wrap it up with thank you, first of all, for having me. I deeply appreciate it. I appreciate being here. I appreciate your trust in letting me present this. I hope there was a lot that you got out of it, and I really look forward to our discussion following this. This person on the screen is Rodney Landreth, and he was one of my mentors, but most importantly, one of my very, very dear friends. He passed away suddenly about a year after marrying my husband and I miss him terribly. He was a fellow Gothar, and most importantly, he was my companion in rants, and we had a good time knowing each other, and I love him a lot. And it's a promise I made to him that this work continues and that we'll hopefully see it published. It's a promise to him to not only stay on his ass about his writing, but for me to stay on my own and to get it done and to finally share what I had been sharing in much smaller terms. He was the person who told me to constantly keep flexing my spiritual muscles. So this work is absolutely dedicated to him and is also in love and dedication to my kindred by Frostway. That gives me everything that I need to sort of function and keep exploring these works in the depths of their importance and sharing them with others. So again, I just want to thank you so much for allowing me to do that and be here. And I think we're going to open up the floor to Q&A now.
Thank you so much for your time. This has been absolutely incredible. This is such an important conversation to be having in paganism right now. This was great. I know that we had at least one question in the chat. Oh, did I hear someone else? I didn't. So I know that we had at least one question in the chat regarding, I saved it for us. Asking, I'd love to know more about why you differentiate high ritual versus lived ritual. You mentioned that the two ritual types can share some of the same elements, but that could still be considered different. You stated multiple examples of ritual, and I'd be curious on where the different examples would fall into those two categories. Additionally, I'm wondering how you feel about solitary ritual, as it seems that all the ritual examples you've discussed are multi-person experiences.
All right. So as I mentioned, the difference for me concerning high ritual is specifically structure and purpose. So with high ritual, as I described earlier, it is in alignment with specific understandings of, if it's not religious specific law, then it's going to be organizational law. Okay, so there's going to be a set of terms that have to be met and adhered to. There's also a progressive structure, which means you have an opening, you have a middle, you have an end, you have a conclusion. It also necessitates hierarchy again. So some person or some persons must be in charge and must be facilitating and overseeing that progressiveness, that rigid progressiveness that happens. And finally, which makes it high ritual versus living ritual, is what I described as it being that participants must adjust to the ritual, adhere to ritual. That makes it high ritual. We that are coming to participate are adjusting to the structures of that, the rules of that, and the purpose of that. Living ritual differentiates in that although it can have structure, it's not as rigidly structured. It's more generally in tune with group customs and understandings rather than the specific law understanding of a particular path or an organization. It's more about what group custom, group understanding is for whomever you're performing that with. It's living in that ritual adapts to participants. Participants don't adapt to ritual. So it's different in that sense. And that's how I differentiate the two. I happen to just be a hyper communal focused person. I've always been that way, even as a little kid. So it's difficult, even sometimes, having to have these discussions and just talk about myself in the singular, because I don't think of myself that way. I think of myself as very, very much involved and integrated into my community and my family, especially, and definitely with the earth. So that just happens to be my personal leaning. It in no way reflects my feelings on thoughts on solitary practice or the legitimacy of it or the potency of it. In fact, I think it's super important that we take time to investigate ritual individually and on a soul level. Again, that has part to do with that piece I mentioned about discovering identity in our core beliefs. So I think it definitely has its place. I do not like the sayings where people like to say that if you're not part of a grove, you're not part of a kindred, or you're not part of a coven, that you're not of any particular spiritual identity or group. I think that's really silly. It's really silly, and it's really dismissive of individuality. You need individuals to make the whole. So I hope that answers that.
Would people be more comfortable in engaging in the question and answer portion if we turned off the recording? If people could sound off in the chat. I'm not seeing any responses. So I have another question.
Sure.
One of the things that you mentioned right at the very end that as I was taking notes, I think I missed. You were talking about how what the overculture tells us about individualism. I was wondering if you could review that really quickly.
Yeah. So
the line that I thought that I heard was that the overculture tells us that individualism is for value, but I'm not sure if I.
The way it defines value is that value is through gain. So value is through gain. Value is through rugged individualism. It's through gain. It's through monetary success. It's through resource hoarding. That's what the American overculture tells us. That's the ideal. Communal endeavors, ritual endeavors, individual endeavors for growth are not celebrated and rewarded in our structure. They're not. So I feel that ritual can be a very potent tool in social justice, especially, and in environmentalism, in changing the tide of that, because the very nature of it doesn't allow you to be individualistic. And that means even when you're working on your own, you still have to be thinking about your core values. You still have to be thinking about your connectedness to other things. You're rooting yourself in what you believe and what you want to see accomplish and unfold. That's very, very different from what our overculture tells us about what success is. Very different. And so that's where I was incorporating that as far as what the messaging we get from the overculture versus where we find ourselves, especially new religious movements, and what we're seeking individually and communally.
Thank you so much for unpacking that again.
Sure.
I appreciate that. Missy, did you want to chime into that bit? I know that that's something that you've been doing some writing on.
Sure. So one of the things that has really stood out to me, so I'm a huge fan of sumo wrestling. And it's my favorite thing because there's just so much community and culture that is expressed in it even today. And I love it. And one of the things that I was exploring was the difference between the individualistic society that we live in here in the United States versus the idea of a collective culture, and how the lessons of individuality aren't something to be thrown away per se, but we can't look at them in a vacuum aside from what the values of a collective society looks like and what it looks like to move through the world thinking about someone beside yourself.
Yeah.
You know, I'm a firm believer that one of the downfalls of our society was when we lost the front porch, because they changed architecture and they stopped putting front porches on houses. And so people started sitting in their backyards with their 6-foot fences and they stopped talking to each other. And that, you know, all of this stems back from also, I had someone asked me a question one time, what would you consider to be the values of the United States? And I was probably feeling very jaded that day. And individuality and materialism were two that were on the list, because we love ourselves and we love our stuff. And, you know, and there's nothing wrong with ourselves. Loving yourself is a great thing to do. I think everybody should do it. 100%, 10 out of 10 would recommend love yourself. And that doesn't mean that you're better than other people. And those are very important distinctions that get left out of the message. So thank you so much for bringing this forward, because I 100% loved everything about this workshop. And I'm just so grateful that you took the time to present this to us. Thank you.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Absolutely. Oh.
Rachel, I'm going to call you out too. I know that you had a strong reaction in the chat to the discussion of eschewing Wicca for its femininity in heathen circles. Rachel, you may be muted. Where did Rachel? Did we lose Rachel?
Looks like we lost Rachel.
Oh well, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Well, I'm gonna pimp somebody else's book. So Dr. Jennifer Snook has a book called American Heathenry, which does a much better exploration on this than anything that I could sum up shortly, and talks a lot specifically about the development of modern heathenry in North America, but also kind of that identity aspect of where things fall concerning Wicca and the not so underlying rejection of femininity being a part of that. You know, I can speak for myself, from my own experience. Part of what pushed me towards heathenry was that I had come out of queer Wiccan spaces, and the tradition that I followed specifically was the Minoan tradition, which was specifically evolved for queer people. So the coven that I was a part of was strictly female, strictly. And so much identity was wrapped up in that, you know what I mean? And wrapped up in that approach. But the misandry was rampant and it didn't feel spiritual at all, at all. And while there were a lot of points that I agreed with, there was a lot that really turned me off, you know? So I was looking for something a lot more balanced than that. And I came into a queer pagan space believing in my mind that probably what was going to happen was that I was going to have this really cool experience where I had to challenge what I understood gender to be and what I even understood deity to be and how it's represented in a gendered manner and what it means to be queer specifically and hold the masculine and the feminine within you and how that's expressed and how it's genderqueered in our larger communities. And that's not what happened. And so I was like, yikes. But then, you know, like I had mentioned, moving into eclecticism, it was kind of off-putting too. I was missing a lot of structure. And then I discovered heathenry. And while there were the aspects of heathenry of hi ho man, there was also this, you know, there is strength in femininity, there's power in femininity, there is more than just being a life bearer, if that is what you are, you know what I mean? There's the aspects of magic, there's the aspects of deep wisdom, There's, the aspects of so much that it felt more whole to me. It felt more whole. It felt more balanced. Of course, like anything, the deeper you dive, the more muck you find. So, there's still a lot. We're still tangled in the weeds in a lot of different ways, but it definitely was an approach that resonated with me because it didn't feel, at least in some regards, so gendered spiritually. It does in presentation, it does in how people socially present, but in the actual spirituality side of things and within ritual, there are definitely gendered aspects, but they're also free to be bent and intermingled, which is a big part of the mythos and the sagas and the stories that we have. So definitely something that I find a lot easier to be a part of.
I think that's a really great point. One of my favorite, one of the things I witnessed that was great, and I don't remember which kindred I was with, but I was attending. It was just a simple bloat, and someone was a guest, and she was concerned because heathenry doesn't really embrace women or feminism and whatever, and the Githya of the kindred turned to her and looked, and all she said was, "The Norns are women," and then just turned around and walked away. And I was like, that's a great point.
So if there's anything else, you guys tap me out. So I don't, are there any more questions or just general comments? Again, I'm just really, thank you so much for having me here. Let me babble at you for 2 hours. It was a blast. It was a real blast.
I feel like I could ask lots of questions, but I'll leave the floor open.
And like I said, I will not be doing it tomorrow because tomorrow's like my real day off. Like no school, no work, nothing. No, but Monday I will be sending you over a citation sheet. So if anybody would like that, it'll have all the information and places where I access stuff for not only my book but personal research and just different discussion points that are outside my personal experience. So I'll be there so that people can do a little digging and exploring beyond that.
Yeah, I would definitely like a copy of that. I can put it on the Facebook event, cool. And I can connect it to the YouTube video when we get that up.
Nice.
Destiny, this is William. Thank you so much. Seriously, thanks for having the conversation with me early on. Thanks for sharing your work with us. This has been inspirational and thought-provoking to a level that we've got used to for a long time, but it's been absent for a while. So thanks for bringing it back.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. And thank you for opening the door for this for me too, because I was going crazy. My family was getting really sick of me. Really sick of me. You can only force them to sit through mock lectures so many times, and then they have enough.
Well, then we'd definitely love to have you back at some point. There was so much more that we'd love to hear you unpack. We'll be in touch. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Cool. Much. Well, I appreciate you and I appreciate your time. If we're done, then I'm gonna stop the recording. Is that okay?
All right.